now on building in public. And we have our guest today is Saar from Charles River Ventures. Welcome, Saar.
Thanks for having me.
And so we were just catching up right before we started. We were talking about snow, and yeah, in Bishop right now it is. I think today the high is gonna be like 80 something degrees, so it's very warm here. Actually, all week it'll be. But Tahoe is, or sorry, Yosemite is still closed, so you can't drive through like Tioga Pass. So we had to go up to South Lake Tahoe to then come down to Bishop to get to the Eastern Sierras. You usually go through Yosemite, but we had to kind of go. So we had snow, a couple of days ago, not active much, but then we got stuck in a hailstorm yesterday when we went out for a run. Up in the mountains, weather changes fast.
Yeah.
So anyway, so you've been spending a lot of time in the mountains, right? And now
we were, we, as you know, we spent a bunch of COVID in Tahoe, and my kids are back in school, so we're back in the Bay Area. Yeah.
Oh, cool. And you're back in office, you were saying, so things are kind of returning to.
Yeah, we're back in the office. I'm in the office. It's been a interesting few weeks because people, as they're vaccinated, are starting to kind of trickle in. There's kind of an awkward, dance of people wearing masks still, but if we're all vaccinated, I think the masks are likely going to come off soon. I've visited some friends of mine this morning down the street here in Palo Alto who were, they were working and not in masks. And now we've been invited into some homes where people are not wearing masks, and it feels like it feels like we're in that awkward teenage phase where if in fact, these variants are blocked by the vaccine, then I think we're going to go back to some sort of normalcy relatively quickly. But these next few weeks are definitely kind of the awkward teenage years of people, flipping back to old life.
Yeah.
Right.
Are there things that for work or otherwise processes or behaviors that you feel like you adopted this past year that you're going to try to continue on? Older way of doing things.
I wanted, because I do think things are going to come back pretty quickly, and I actually wanted to write some of those things down that I've really enjoyed and sort of keep them as a reminder to that period, and kind of honor the period. I think for me, just being in venture capital, we sell money, and so much of my job pre-COVID was running around, going to companies, even for kind of first meetings and lots of coffees with people and walks with people. But as someone who has 3 young kids, a lot of that was just quite taxing on my personal life to be in San Francisco 2-3 days a week, living in the South Bay. And, I really hope that I can limit some of that. I remember, when David remembers, I used to live in San Francisco, and then I joined a firm that had an office in Sand Hill, and I basically wouldn't get up to San Francisco. I'd come once or twice a month. I just kind of feel like with young kids in particular, trying to be home for dinners and just taking out a lot of that noise. I hope I can hold on to some of that as best I can.
It seems like a lot of the way, given how much stuff seems to be moving online, it almost seems like there's more opportunity for you to shape your set of meetings and interactions and relationships to kind of fit, I remember, actually, I don't know if you'll recall this, but it was definitely over 10 years ago. You made a comment to me about how it feels harder to be at every serendipitous dinner party drinks thing because you never know, it could turn out that you meet just the right person. It's magic, but the likely case is that it's not. And so, knowing how to invest your time in those is challenging. But I wonder if, now we are, that was well over 10 years ago. You told me that. I don't know if you remember that.
I don't.
But, does it sound like something you thought?
Yeah, totally. I think that is the ongoing challenge for venture capitalists, right? So many of the most incredible opportunities for me have, come from the randomness of Silicon Valley or, putting yourself being curious and just learning about people and their interests and, things that look weird, as David, you heard me say often,
Yeah.
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 And
How is that? How have you been like, where have you been finding things that look weird this past year? Like, what kind of are the internet
Yeah.
gathering spots that you think are
I
interesting?
think the cool, no, yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think what's been awesome, I think there's a set of folks that have been doing this for a long time online, right? In subreddits and like in,
Yeah.
interesting, the bowels of the internet. And,
yeah,
and this has kind of forced, a number, like I've had a lot of meetings now over Zoom with people that, I just reached out to, over something they posted or a comment they
yeah,
made, and connected with them, just say, hey, would love to chat, and I think that was a lot less common or felt a bit more awkward in the past. So I think, a lot of that has moved online, for sure.
yeah. We talk a lot about the kind of institutionalized spaces versus the wild spaces. And I wonder if there are places that you're spending more time online that feel like they're less optimized and refined and more like wild. Like one of the examples that I think Gary Tan had mentioned is that the kind of product hunt of the world is like well understood as a place to go to find products, and so kind of everybody does it, and it's kind of efficient at finding new things. But then Suhail has this like a Discord called Shipping Fridays,
Yeah.
and Gary was commenting on like that's just like a totally wild space, and all kinds of weird stuff shows up there, and it's accidental projects, hack projects on a weekend, and it has no seriousness to it, which almost is kind of what I think you want to find. And I wonder, do you find, are there new spaces that you find yourself spending more time that have that kind of wild feel to them?
Nothing jumps out. I mean, I've tried a lot of these. There's a number of communities definitely that have moved online that people have built, whether it's Discord or Slack or even just some email groups with folks. I don't know. Maybe it's me, but I just feel like COVID has gotten me so screen tired
Yeah.
in some ways that. Yeah, I think the natural, I guess the way I would describe it is like, I tend to be very passion oriented. So I think the easiest thing for me has been to, when I follow, if it's like quantified self and, blood glucose monitoring or
Yep.
some weird idea, I read some Wired article about like the death process. And then I look at a bunch of startups and kind of like dig, and I think it's those explorations, that have led me to kind of tinker and go, who's this person on, and like, find someone on Twitter or like see if I have a connection to them or, or just start emailing customers, support on some random, tiny little product. And
Right.
I've really found those are the areas that I've naturally gravitated towards, only because I think I'm so screen tired that I'm not looking to like park myself and just like have stuff come at me. If that makes sense.
But I mean, so you've had some, I mean, truly epic early insight and early investments that you've made. So I think I'd point to DoorDash as maybe that. I think you were first money in, and my understanding is you discovered that just through kind of living your life. You were sort of, it wasn't through the screen; it was through, I think, were you at Oren's Hummus? Is I think the story
I was doing diligence, on a different startup. Yeah.
Oh wow.
And
awesome.
so I wonder if you can take us to a little bit of like what did that feel like, or how did that story work from your perspective, and how common does that feel like as like a pattern that you might see, kind of that just kind of living your life and discovering the things that way?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think David, you've known me long enough. It's like every once in a while, I would form a thesis around a space, like a problem space. And, I call it like a theme, not a thesis. Like, it's like, an example in a theme for me was like, productivity apps on the mobile phone, is like, it just felt like, the smartphone launches, everyone was trying to jam the same applications onto a smaller screen. and no one was thinking about the mobile phone as like a way to build new applications. So, you and I were fortunate to work with the mailbox team that was sort of reinventing email, but then it was really like an example. My friend Dan Bomsey was working on this mileage tracking company that I had introduced you to, and I was like, I don't know how big this can be, but this is such a great, elegant example of what a mobile phone could do in tracking. It just turns out for tax reasons, you need to keep this log of all the miles that you drive, right? Either for tax purposes or for expense reimbursement. And using GPS, Dan had this great idea that a mobile phone could take all that work away from you and just do it automatically. And no one had ever thought of building this magical experience, right? And so that, to me, that's an example of like a theme. Like I had this prepared mind on like, there should be cooler mobile apps that take advantage of the phone, but that exact use case was not one I was looking for. Food delivery for me was very different. I had a young kid at the time. I was, very much stuck at home. My wife was running, her small set of yogurt cafes, and very much, from a product experience, I could see what Uber had done in taking this moment of frustration and turning it into a moment of delight, right? For anyone that was living in San Francisco back then, if you needed a cab to the airport, it was probably one of you almost needed therapy by the time you got to the airport, because you just really didn't know. Like the cab companies would outright lie to you about the fact that they were coming, and you would then miss your flight, like it would happen regularly, and so that certainty, looking back now, it's kind of easy to say, but back then it was like there's something magical in this experience. It was kind of hard to put words around it. But what I saw was really this like inflection of taking something that was uncertain and turning it certain. And as someone who was spending a lot of time watching our young child at home and needing to cook dinner all the time, I just very much felt like food delivery at that time really sucked. There were no reliable services. And in a similar way, felt like, someone would create a similar experience around really just doing delivery well. And sometimes there's a unique insight, to go quote Richard Branson of I Am the Market. My wife was running this very popular yogurt store, and people were calling her all the time saying, could you deliver? And at one point, we had a delivery van, we had a driver, we had to guarantee that driver hours, and we never knew when the phone was going to ring. And so doing one-off home deliveries made no sense. We could do catering and other things, but the idea that someone would actually build a pooled set of drivers for all these restaurants like Fresh Yogurt, also made sense to me. And so it was kind of in that spirit that I had a thesis. It was like someone's going to do kind of Uber for food delivery, and I was on a mission to go find that company, and that's really where I got very there's a lot of luck and randomness in venture, and very I was just super lucky that my friend who was the general manager of Orange Hummus, I was doing a reference on another company called Fluck that Shervin and Greylock ended up seeding. I ended up passing. And it was in that reference that, and I've tweeted this, Misty famously said, like, don't waste your time with this Fluck team. There's these kids out of Stanford that you really have to meet. They've been super thoughtful. They really understand our problem deeply. And that was kind of
You think that's a tweet?
The luck. I tweeted the Misty reference because she first sent me an email response, and then I got on the phone with her. But that first email was really what led to DoorDash.
Wow,
that's such a cool story. Wow, are there any areas that feel like that right now, where you're like, this is a friction that I totally see exists, and it might be unclear sort of what emerges to fill a certain need? Like, what is on your mind right now?
That's a good question. I would say I don't have any thesis, like clear thesis.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of things that I would say I'm kind of curious about. An example, like one area that I've spent, this will totally sound weird, but spent a lot of time thinking about is actually how we process death. There's been some fascinating like, here's a fun fact, like in our lifetime, or actually in the last 100 years, one of the biggest consumer changes that humanity has experienced is actually how we process the dead. Meaning, if you just look in the US, cremations have gone from less than 10% to, in Washington State, it's over 90. I think it's now over 70
Wow.
or 80% of all deaths are cremated. We still think of the movies of, like, a funeral with a burial plot. It just turns out like that's a boomer view of the world.
Oh,
like,
wow.
It's very inconvenient. People are, first of all, people are less religious. Burial plots are expensive. We now live, we're not distributed. We don't all live on a farm and just like all are going to stay in one place. So for a number of reasons, we've seen this cultural change, but as a result, religions have provided a lot of very important grieving processes too, that leaves this huge gap, and you've seen this with COVID now, where someone gets cremated and like people are trying to figure out how to memorialize that person. Anyway, so I just think that that's like a very intellectually interesting area. Again, I tend to be a software and technology investor, so sometimes I can, I'll get excited about a trend, not unlike my wife's business that we had in the Greek yogurt space, but it's not an investment for CRV or the right fit. But as a trend, I think it's very interesting how we're seeing new products and new solutions for the death process. Otherwise, I think in terms of pure technology, I continue to love different products around marketplaces and mobile. I still think it's kind of early days. I think, remain curious about what's happening in crypto in terms of enabling new experiences that just weren't possible before with technology. I'd say, as David knows, I tend to be very experience driven and want to see a problem really solved, and with technology, ideally and highly scalable. And and I think that crypto is maturing to the point where we may see some really elegant and interesting new applications, but it still feels very early days. So it's a long-winded way of saying nothing is focused as my journey in food delivery, but we just haven't had a big platform like mobile that has inspired me in the same way.
Yeah.
You mentioned kind of mobile and marketplaces, and I'm still quite enthusiastic that there's a lot to be done, but I think some people kind of feel like, yeah, we did that for 10 years and they're kind of mostly there. So I wonder, do you think that the reason that, like, do you find excitement in the fact that there's like some new changes that are just now possible, or is it more just like there's undiscovered turf that people just haven't explored that maybe could have been done 2 or 3 or 5 years ago, but it's just kind of now, somebody great figured out a way to kind of assemble the pieces?
I would say it's a little bit of both. Like, on one side, I think you just have a lot of things that have changed on the infrastructure side that enable services to work in ways that they didn't before. Everything from payments, better cameras, the ability to ship things, the infrastructure that, a Poshmark or others created will allow people to sort of build on the back of that. Or even the ability to ship food, right? Like you saw this with the initial meal box companies, but now, what's been enabled in e-commerce around food is fascinating. Birthday cakes and cupcakes and all these things we can send, in ways that just weren't possible 10 years ago. I think will allow new marketplaces. As a DoorDash investor, DoorDash Drive, it's fascinating. So there are companies now, one in the Bay Area called Chef, that's like an Etsy for chefs, that, can now leverage the DoorDash infrastructure to do deliveries. And so as a startup who's trying to get a certain product to a customer on time or pick something up on time, to now leverage the DoorDash infrastructure to do that, is super interesting. And so I think we can now see all these ideas that maybe just were kind of too complicated and had too many barriers initially can now leverage that infrastructure to try these things again. Etsy for home chefs is not a new idea. It's
right.
we've seen, I don't know, a long list of startups die, trying to win that market. And yet, combination of regulatory changes plus different infrastructure allows, startups to try that in a much more capital efficient ways and focus on their core competence, of acquiring supply or changing a consumer experience. So, I think there's that. And then I think there's also just a change, the fun part of consumer investing is consumer preferences are always, changing and evolving, right? So, you see this with alcohol trends, young people, athletes, people just aren't drinking the way that they were, right? They want things like, Peter Pham's Liquid Death, they want a cool water, but, and they want, other sorts of beverages. And that I think will continue and always happen. And then the question is just for us, like, what are the really fun, software and network effect related businesses we can find around that. But there's a lot that we just see constantly changing in health and wellness. A lot in our understanding of nutrition as another area, right? With continuous blood glucose monitors, and these experiences are just broken. They're painful. Like if you've ever worn one, and but we fully expect that there's like real value to be had from these technologies and those insights. So, how do we make them easier, more accessible, less painful, more delightful? I think are all massive opportunities.
Right. I wonder, actually, it stokes a question that we ask sometimes here, and I wonder sort of how you would frame this. But when you talk about some of the infrastructure that's been built that enables these new experiences, it seems like you might come across the question of how much is this infrastructure that creates a new experience that's a new company versus how much does this infrastructure build out mean that the builder of the infrastructure owns the opportunity to build the new company. And so there seems like there'd always be, a tension there. And, just to put it concretely, at the time you were, first learning about DoorDash, one could have assumed, like Uber will get to this because they own this distribution network. And I think there's a lot of differences in the depth of integration in the restaurant and the, and specifically the suburban focus as opposed to the urban focus, the DoorDash instance, if I understand correctly. But I wonder, like, how much of that do you look for? How do you sort of distinguish when the infrastructure provider should also be owning the kind of the enabled application versus how much of it is like new opportunity?
I think it's a great question, and I don't think we always know, right? I think we've seen in the Facebook example in social where large companies have really defended their turf aggressively, right? Everything from buying Onavo on competitive intelligence to how they squash distribution on their platforms to help others, and and then I think there's plenty of examples where things have broken out either because of strategy or an understanding of a problem or an approach that's different, and so I don't think we always know. I think for us, I think you've heard me tell the story of the cargo cults, a few times. Like, to me, it's when we find founders who seem to understand a problem quite deeply and have a different perspective on how they would solve it, that we sort of end up betting in the long term that they will continue to kind of innovate and figure those things out. And so even if people are trying to copy them, the hope is we'll always stay kind of one step ahead. And if you use that example with Apple, right, it wasn't just the touchscreen. Like eventually other people figured out touchscreens, but it's their constant innovation, like their ability to ship and improve on such a regular basis, that I think has let them dominate market share, and trying to find those teams that can have that sort of execution, I think is key in those particular markets where you've got large incumbents, with lots of resources.
That's
Or they just
interesting.
have to look very weird, right? So as I seeded Patreon and have been very involved. And I mean, at the time, not just, the outside world, my partners, it just seemed like a crazy idea that people would like pay money, to creators directly on the internet. And that could be any sort of sizable business, just, sounded crazy to most people. And for years I would talk about how excited I was about, Patreon. It would just sort of fall on deaf ears to, many friends and co-investors and other people. And, and now, fast forward how the world has changed. Every major media company, Facebook, Spotify, Twitch, you name it, has a direct payment model. And so I think that's also, one of the things that I often say is like embracing the weird. But when if you spend time with Jack when he started Patreon, he understood the problem deeply. He had a point of view on why this, a direct payment model was literally 100x better than an ad-driven model, and so, it was worth kind of going on that journey and hoping that, we would be right one day.
Right, and I'm curious actually, because that's another great one where you spotted it really early, and it was a very weird thing. So, is there anything like, how did you originally connect with Jack, or what was it that, like, were you already prepared mind on this direct pay idea, or did something about his background, his articulation, kind of help you see this future?
Yeah, so Patreon, I'd say, is a combination of two things. One is I was very curious about what, I had been involved in causes, as David, you would remember a long time ago. And I think one of the reasons causes didn't work is back then people didn't trust putting money directly on the internet for, causes.
Right.
Kickstarter to me was like the Friendster of crowdfunding. It sort of like broke through. And I think through video as a storytelling media on YouTube really convinced strangers on the internet to put money, and fund projects. And so I was very excited about Kickstarter. And then I similarly was excited about kind of Kickstarter as a theme, like Friendster. There's going to be more.
Yeah.
Anything that kind of looked or smelled like crowdfunding was very interesting to me, whether it was crowdfunding medical bills. The founder of Blue Apron actually had his first startup was called Petri Dish. It was crowdfunding science projects that didn't work, and he pivoted.
Oh, wow.
But that's what he raised his original seed round on. And anyway, there was a set of interesting ideas happening around that time. And so, that was like an area that I was interested in. And then in the background, I had spent a lot of time personally in the online advertising space. And so when Jack sort of pitched like, hey, at $1 CPM and 50,000 views per video, I make $50, and it only would take 100 people to give me $10 a month to like blow, like for me to make so much more money.
Yeah,
he sort of authentically understood that, and he could point to like who those fans were. Like, he really knew that every time he uploaded a video, he had this hardcore fan base that was watching every video to completion. And so I think it was kind of that insight of like, ads, and this is a 10x, 100x better product if it works. Plus, I think that people are going to be, as a theme, are willing to engage in this behavior. And then lastly, because I use this example here at CRV when we try and train our younger investors about like, how do you gain conviction when these things look so raw and so ugly. And, Jack was a musician, and he pitched in the seed round. He said, by the way, I'm going to keep touring. I'm not doing this full time. I'm going to take your money, but I'm, just so we're clear, I'm not going to draw a salary. Like, he's super ethical. But it was like, I'm going to try and work on this while I'm touring. And there's a famous, video that I show of, one of the projects that Jack worked on, where he had this dream of making this amazing music video, and he maxed out his credit card, and he had these, dancing robots and a whole set from Star Wars that, he built from scratch. But what I loved about, there was a behind the scenes video on how he made the music video. And in it, if there was ever like a video of just like a growth mindset founder, you see him talk about how he like knew nothing about robotics, but he taught himself how to make the robot, dance to the rhythm, and he knew nothing about making a background set, and he just like he figured all these things out, and he also convinced all these friends of his to volunteer their time to pull together this video. And so I think I often use that example because I think for many investors who would have just met Jack and just heard, because thought of him as a musician,
yep,
would have said, this is crazy. He's not doing it full time. He's a musician. He's never worked in a great startup. Right. But if you had seen that video, I think you would have just said, man, this guy is really special, and I think we'll figure it out. And
yep.
And then on top of that, you asked me how we got connected. Evan Tana, is a close friend and had known Jack and Sam Yam, who was his co-founder from Looped, where Mark Jacobstein is one of my closer friends, and so we were able to quickly reference the team and just move quickly, and that was the Patreon story.
That's so cool. Great. It's also like that kind of stuff wouldn't come up in what people think of as traditional like VC pitch meetings, very like focused just on the deck and what couple slides. It's like you kind of have to gain conviction in the person as a person, and like what their ability to learn and like pivot will be seems to be like a really important signal. You're saying that's kind of interesting to think about how do you try to unearth that signal in a person, like when they're pitching their first idea to you, like knowing that it's probably not going to be what the finished product ends up as.
I think it's really hard. I mean, as David knows, I had backed one of my closer friends, Jamie Siminoff, in a company called Unsubscribe. Then backed him again in what became Ring. And in Unsubscribe, to your point, I think I famously told him, I hate this idea. I don't think it's going to work. But if I can buy 20% of Jamie Siminoff for $1.6 million, I'd be an idiot not to do that. And I just hope it turns into something. And I think that was because I had to your point, I had watched and gotten to know Jamie over his prior business, which was a business called Phone Tag, and just thought he was remarkable in many ways as a founder, as someone who had original product thought, as someone who knew how to get things done and not only to get them done quickly, but when he would describe an idea, the physical manifestation of those prototypes were just phenomenal. And so getting some sense of that, I think, is really helpful, and that's ideal. But as often founders, when they just tell the story, it can come across, in a single pitch, and immediately, it resonates, and we can verify that that all those things are true. But often when there's an authenticity to the story, and again this kind of unique perspective into a problem and a unique view into how to solve it, it can come across in a single pitch, and we can absolutely engage quickly.
I wonder how much of I don't know Jamie as well as you at all, but I've met him a few times through you. But I don't know sort of his talents that he came to something like Ring with versus how much he grew into or built over time. And I wonder if my understanding of Ring is it must have some crazy complex hardware, manufacturing kind of supply chain issues that he'd probably never dealt with. So maybe he surrounded himself with great people. And then if I recall correctly, wasn't he like one of the early ones who used Shark Tank really effectively as a marketing mechanism? And is that like stuff he already had kind of the DNA for, or is that something he kind of grew into, or how did he up level, and how did he surround himself with other people?
This is my recollection. Jamie might have a different point of view of what was truth, but I think some of it honestly is that growth mindset. Like, he's been fearless. I've seen Jamie work on a lot of different businesses over time, and more importantly, even solve problems. Like, he's one of these unique people that sees these flossing problems that other people don't see, and it drives him nuts. And he just can't help himself. He just has to kind of fix them. And he, what I've loved about him is he just knows he can figure it out, and he'll figure it out. And so and an example of that, it actually is related to Shark Tank. I remember, to his credit, first of all, I didn't watch a lot of TV at the time. I didn't realize how popular it was, but from a distribution perspective, I think, he sort of realized that this could really be helpful to his business. And, I don't remember Jamie before that, being super, camera seeking or anything.
Right. Yeah.
I remember talking to him when he was practicing. Like, he took it super seriously. He built a fake set in his garage, and he just was like working on it, just like any, great founder, I guess you would accept. But he really did want to make it to the air. And so he's kind of self-taught, and I think we've seen great teams do that time and time again. David, it reminds me, the story when I remember the Mailbox team, Gentry and Scott. They decided at that time, this is years ago, they needed a launch video, and most startups at that time would hire, Matchbox or some agent, famous agency to go do their thing. And to their credit, they knew nothing about making videos, but they went and they became students of the space. They studied every video. And I just remember in our board meeting, they came back and they gave me this lecture on launch videos. And they basically said, if your product is not that good, you end up with the Budweiser commercial of like what your life should look like. Like, you'll be surrounded by the Swedish bikini team, and you'll be strong, and you'll, or the mall, whatever, any of these like aspirational things. And then they came back and they said, but if you're like Apple, if you really have a product that solves a problem, all of those launch videos focus on the features and ultimately get you to the arrival state of what those features deliver, which is, in the case of Inbox Zero, it was like, so they had dissected that Apple had only used, I think it was 3 different shots that they would flip back and forth between. Anyways, they basically orchestrated this whole narrative. I don't know how much of it was actually true, but it was their analysis of every successful startup launch video. And out of that just said, okay, so then we wrote a script. We came up with the shot angles. We pitched, these agencies to do it. And they just said, this is like as good as anything we'd come up with. You should just do it yourself at this point. And so they rented a camera and filmed the video themselves. And after they launched to a great success, they had, this huge wait list that everyone, remembers, we got all these inbounds of who did their launch video? We want to hire them for our startup, and it was sort of like, I don't know how to tell you this, but this is where this original product thought comes from, that this unique view of we're just going to figure it out because it's crucial for our company to do a good job at it. And, anyway, that's also Jamie in so many things that he does.
Mm-hmm. Where he kind of becomes he may not have the expertise, but he has the growth mindset and kind of becomes obsessive about how to, what are the mechanics that make that thing work well. One of the things that I think, we've seen a lot in our own work is that the more that we can do more of the things ourselves, the deeper we can understand the problems. So an example is, actually, the individual who wrote the first lines of software for Highlighter now basically spends all of his time in Figma, and he doesn't consider himself a designer, except he's actually best at designing all of the things that we need because he understands all of the trade-offs. And yeah, actually, we're about to launch a new UX in another couple of days, but it's so much cleaner and hangs together so much better than what we currently have. And I think whenever we've worked with kind of third party trying to explain what we're trying to accomplish, there's so much that's lost in translation versus when we kind of as a coherent team that have worked together and are trying to achieve something together, we understand the problem deeper than a third party can. So I think it speaks to some of the we may not be professionals or experts, and it sounds like Jamie as well, may not have been an expert as an on-air personality, but I think, there's something about the commitment to the DIY that through that process, you learn how to do it best in the very specific context where it's never been done before, because you're sort of
Not only that. I mean, I'll tell you, what comes to mind, because I've been lucky to work with some companies that have gotten, to scale, and I've worked with a lot of companies that haven't. And when I think about, the characteristics of, early on, when, if you're lucky to find strong product market fit, many VCs will say, hire people that have done that have run a playbook, and what I find though is like, the great founders still are willing to go deep. They're still willing to ask the questions. They're still willing to, break with the norms if they don't agree with it. And
Right.
And what we find with some young founders is, to your point, they'll hire people that are functional experts, but then truly like outsource it. And then they're very frustrated with the results. The results in your example could be a design that doesn't solve the problem, but it could also be that like, your financials or your cash burn all of a sudden is like, something's out of whack.
Right.
Because they didn't understand the problem deeply or catch things in the ways that you need them to run your business effectively. A classic example might be, you have a CFO, but for some reason, as you're ramping your paid marketing, the unit economics are upside down, and the CFO doesn't catch it, and it's sort of that level of engagement from the founders who are just sort of like not willing to just like let people run with things, but want to understand deeply the details, and really collaborate, that I think has led to the successes for sure.
Do you ever see that get in the way? Like, I think the flip of that is kind of the micromanager, total control of everything. And at some level of scale, you have to, hire great people and entrust that they're going to do a great job. So do you find that flip, is it like a conscious thing? And do you coach people when you see them needing to make that but not willing to, or how does that play out?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's, with competence and trust that gets built over time, right? And then certain things need to be tweaked for your business, which ideally the great ideas, I think, come out of collaboration. So it's like, that's the magic. I often say it's like, the old experienced people who have, run a playbook with the young people who know how to ask questions or do things differently, with the right culture where it's like high level of trust and execution orientation seems to be the that could easily get off one way or another, for sure. But, but often just trusting your gut on what are the real problems you're trying to solve for, and just, not being willing to ask stupid questions or revisit things that don't feel right, whether it's in product, whether it's in any number of things, I think is really where it's just easy to, remove yourself or, not be engaged. That's when things tend to go sideways.
I'm actually curious how you talked about trusting your gut, and if you look back on your career in investing and kind of how your decision-making process has changed over time, like what things do you think you've weighted, either like underweighted or overweighted in the past, that you're thinking about differently now? Or have there been like, I don't know, tangible changes to how you approach that process yourself, and like balancing gut intuition versus other factors and all these things?
It's a really great question, and I wish I would just say there's so much randomness in startups that I think that's why I still skip to work every day. There's always more things for me to learn, and the way things happen in the past are different than the way they'll happen in the future. The things that seem to be changing, I think that entrepreneurship is getting democratized in a amazing way that's very exciting, but also in some ways challenging, in that I think entrepreneurs don't have the same competitive advantage that they may have from 10 or 15 years ago. It just turned out it was hard to Facebook needed to rack servers. That was like a core competence that made it hard. Friendster largely failed because they couldn't keep the servers up, and page load time of photos had a huge impact on engagement for, Facebook in ways that the next generation of startups, don't have to compete in the same way. So, I think just trying to figure out for us in a particular business, what are the core competencies and how does the team, line up against that? And in a world that's constantly changing, I think is something that we're always revisiting, to the point of different horses for different courses. If it's a sales driven motion, my friends at Okta coming out of Salesforce, were like the right people to build that business because they just had all these relationships and they knew top down sales. But, then the world changed and Okta recently, bought Auth0, which was a developer, kind of a bottoms up motion where the developer is the buyer and, in a space that's very related. And so, in that case, for a developer led company, the founders are going to look really different. And so I think we just try and be conscious in terms of those biases and not thinking that every founder is going to fit a certain profile.
How does that play out in like group situations at the firm? Like, how do you think about presenting information for the first time to other partners, or how people vote, or like pre-mortems, post-mortems? How?
Yeah, it's a really insightful question because, since we've been doing this, I've now been doing this for a bit, but we've got, 18 funds of history. A simple example is, I think 10 years ago, VC firms spent a lot of time talking about the founder. Like if you went around the room, people would say like, I love David. He's an awesome founder. He's going to be a great, he's going to be a killer or whatever. In most cases, I think at least here at CRV, we say like in an hour, there's nothing that like you're going to get to know about this founder. Like you're going to have an initial response, but like if I tell you I love the founder, I hate the founder as the sponsor, I better love the founder. I really don't care what you guys, what the rest of the partnership thinks about the founder. I'm happy to talk about the market. I'm happy to talk about, the net dollar retention if it's a SaaS business, or, other customer references that we heard, things that are, in the spirit of like intellectual honesty, things we can truly debate. But I think if I just go back historically, I think there were a lot of founder discussions about, the founders. And at least for us, we've just recognized that, if people see a founder in an hour, I think their ability to fundraise, will this person be a good fundraiser? Can they sell a story? Some of that feedback can be helpful if that's something that will be heavily required for that particular business. But just like, are they a great founder? Or are they not a great founder? Very important question, but it's really you learn that by spending a lot of time with the person, and we just don't talk about that in the partnership in the way that we used to many years ago.
That's really interesting. I also I always wonder about like how to avoid groupthink in situations, in like collective decision-making situations particularly. And we've heard some interesting proposals from different people. Like Annie Duke came on and she had this model of like everyone does anonymous votes at first, and you always have the most junior people read out their answer first so that they don't kind of like change their mind to agree with more senior folks and stuff like that. I don't know, what do you think about kind of avoiding groupthink situations, and particularly when there are like power differences in a room?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we've tried a lot of these things, both in bias of young people versus old people, also as in terms of if the best investor in the room says something, it just is heard differently than the new person that is new to venture. I think culturally, though, we often want to hear the fresh, the fresh voices first. But I actually think that the most important thing for us culturally that we've learned over time is our best investments have actually all been highly controversial inside the partnership. And so how do you build a culture where we can totally disagree intellectually on a company, but you don't take it personally, especially if you're like a newer investor or, and it's, and these are tough calls. Early, everything is going to be early and ugly. It's not going to be obvious. That's where the best early stage investments come from. And so I think that's where I think we intentionally try and build this, relationship of trust and support, where it's sort of like I I want you to hear what I think, but I also, once you leave this room, if you've got the support of the partnership, let me, tell me how I can help you win this company, even if I don't like the project
Yeah.
and I think that's really at the core of, I think, what we have found to be successful, because out of that, then people are willing to say what they think, knowing that, it's really just in the spirit of trying to be helpful, and it comes from a good place, and we can disagree, and that those investments actually are likely to be the most successful ones anyway.
I wonder, does that stuff get established? I know you've done a lot of out of the office kind of work as a team and with the broader community around you and CRV, kind of with the kiting stuff during an era. Is that kind of stuff like a focus of the firm to get the firm and the broader community together, kind of doing non-work things to nurture that kind of trust, or are there sort of different goals or aims for those kinds of things?
It's a good, yeah. And I mean, I wouldn't say I think we've really, as a firm, actually been really bad at executing, on operational stuff. I think we just so many of us love what we do, and end up spending most of our time doing that, and have underinvested, I think, in a lot of the other, community and event type programming that we've seen other firms really focus on.
Mm-hmm. Are there things you mentioned earlier about how, sort of when you have the new generation of investors, the younger folks who are coming on and kind of learning the craft, that you have certain kind of experience and advice that you can share in sort of how to think about company or where to avoid pitfalls? I wonder if there's sort of, information flow or learning in the opposite direction, where somebody comes in and maybe turns you on to some new ideas or new workflows or new ways of thinking about the world that shape your worldview in investing.
Absolutely. Especially younger people, they just can, their behaviors are different, their priorities are different. The way in which they think the world will play out, will be different. I'll use an example. We have a confidential investment we haven't announced yet. It's sort of in the environmental space, and it's just really interesting how, when we went around the room for feedback, basically all of the older investors were like, this is a nice to have, but not a need to have. And all the younger investors were like, you assholes, like, this is absolutely, like, super important to us and a need to have, like, and I just think that's like where those perspectives are so helpful, in terms of really listening to, how the world could play out, or what's important to this next generation.
Mm-hmm. Are there certain? So it sounds like the climate is one topic. One thing that I feel like I've been more aware of recently. I mean, I wouldn't say it's like a huge surprise, but I feel like the memetic nature of products, broadly, it feels like there's something there that is not yet really captured or managed properly, but it's like it's alive, every day on TikTok, and the dances and the music and like the creative processes that are sort of shareable and remixable. But I wonder, does that work its way into like other types of consumer products that are not themselves focused on that creation process, but that somehow are memetic in similar ways? I wonder, is that a theme that I feel like that's something when I, younger folks who I follow on Twitter, I feel like that's part of the kind of the vibe that I get from paying attention to that kind of stuff. I wonder if that plays out across current investments or kind of shapes some of your thinking.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great example. I'll just use a plug for, a portfolio company of mine. I funded a company called Kapwing.
Oh yeah, and we're customers.
Oh, amazing. Amazing. Yeah. Okay, so I mean, the team is very ambitious. If they've publicly said they want to kill Adobe. Adobe is a very big company, and I think early on when they raised their Series A, their main product was a meme generator, and I think a lot of Silicon Valley VCs, to your point, were like, couldn't connect the dots between killing Adobe and a meme generator. Well, it turns out we funded the company, and then the primaries happened, and if you followed the Bernie campaign at all, memes were the number one social media tool that a number of the candidates were using, and so it turned out many of them were using Kapwing. So it kind of goes back to your point of that would be an example where we love that because it's software, it's kind of an infrastructure side of a meme culture, but also with a very big target as to what they want to go after. Where you don't kill Adobe by going after the old media formats. You build a new Adobe based on the new media formats that people are using, and I think that's probably a good example of kind of how we think about some of those things. But sometimes it could even be related to cultural ideas. Like I think of car ownership as one. I grew up in a where my parents were immigrants. They didn't have any money, but the big deal was I remember my mom had had a friend who owned a Jaguar. It was a big deal to see this Jaguar. And there was this car culture in America that had come from the 60s into the 70s. That it was people showed off their cars. It was a big deal, and especially in LA and California. Yeah. And so I think many people who had visions of making money, would focus on this, the car they drive in Miami. Right. I think that still somewhat exists. But younger people, from all the research we can tell, don't really give a shit about whether they own a car or what kind of car they have. Right. That has massive implications to whether, how you view ride sharing or no ride sharing or, other things, other companies that we look at.
Yeah. Yep. I'm sure just having kids is going to give you such an interesting view into what's coming up, what they find interesting and what are they talking about with their friends. And I just, even my sister's boyfriend's little brothers somehow invested in Dogecoin and all of these things, knew about the GameStop stuff. And I was just what? How did you guys know about this? And it's just because they're on YouTube all day long and Discord and pick this stuff up. So yeah, I think having that pulse is really interesting.
Paying attention to culture, yeah.
Yeah, totally.
Cool. Well, I know we're already over time for the time we carved out to spend together, so we don't want to keep you from your next meetings. But I wanted to thank you for spending the time, Saar. It's always fun. Great to catch up. And this was particularly fun because I just feel you probably don't know how many of your words ring in my ear every day. Some things that you've said to me over the last decade or so of friendship, it things happen and I hear you say something that you'd said to me before. So so it's
amazing.
It's nice
super kind of you to say. Well, same man. I'm so grateful for our friendship and treasure all the memories and the future memories that we'll create together. So I really appreciate you having me on this.
Cool. And, well, thank you so much for spending the time. Really appreciate it.
Same. I can't wait to see you in person. And enjoy the trip.
Yep. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. See ya.